Hi, I'm Dubba, I'm the Director of Music Tech Fest, and this is the MTF Podcast. UK journalist and writer Hattie Collins is the music editor for ID magazine. She writes for The Guardian, The Sunday Times, Condé Nast Traveller, Beat and more, and she's ghostwritten books for the likes of Tiny Temper, Jessie J and Dynamo. You'll often hear her contributing as a cultural commentator on BBC Radio, and she consults to brands on youth lifestyle trends. Hattie's the author of This Is Grime, which features incredible images by award-winning photographer Olivia Rose, and it's one of those rare books about a music scene that has universal and unanimous 5-star reviews all over Amazon. Hattie is pretty much the world expert on grime, and she writes about it in a way that's accessible, engaging, and also lets the subjects of the book, the artists, speak for themselves. This Is Grime is an oral history. Now, full disclosure, I know and like some grime and can probably name a handful of artists, but I am not an expert in any sense of the word. So I caught up with Hattie in Manchester a couple of months back, and we sat down for a chat so she could fill in some of the gaps. This is Hattie Collins, and this is Grime. Okay, first of all, what's grime?
Ooh, grime is a type of music that came from East London, originated in East London around the early noughties, around 2001, around that sort of time, 2002. Essentially speaking, it's around 140 BPM, so it's faster, it's a bit more, I guess you could almost call it dance music, but it features MCs rapping over the top of it. What's
the relationship, I mean, you hear rapping, what's the relationship between grime and hip-hop, say?
There are elements, I suppose, that are borrowed from hip-hop, the fact that the MCs rap, but there's probably more in common with things like Jamaican dancehall, which was very much rooted in clashing. So there's a lot of clashing in grime, lots of battles. But yeah, in terms of the BPM, in terms of the relationship between artists, it has more in common, I'd say, with Jamaican dancehall music than hip hop. But yeah, obviously they rap, so there are those similarities.
Okay, so let me just talk about how you got into this, because obviously you're a writer. What's your sort of background? What led you to this?
Well, long story short, I wanted to go and live in New York, and I thought if I was able to do that, I could. The way I thought I was able to do that would be to do a degree in hip hop, because I was just a big hip hop fan, had been for years. That didn't exist, but I started writing some reviews of stuff to try and get a scholarship to go to NYU. I didn't get the scholarship, but I ended up getting published. And then I had the very good fortune to meet someone called Chantal Fiddy at my first job at Touch magazine, where I was writing mostly about US hip-hop and R&B. And she introduced me to grime. She introduced me to Dizzee Rascal, a really early Dizzee Rascal record, which I thought was absolute shit. But then a couple of days later, I was like, oh, that shit song you play it again. And that was my introduction to grime. I didn't know what it was, didn't understand it, didn't know if I liked it, but something drew me in, and that was around 2003, I think.
Wow, so really early on.
Yeah, long time ago. Yeah, right. I'm old.
Can I just backtrack a little bit then, because there's obviously a long journey that gets you to that. I'm kind of interested. What did your parents do, and how did that affect what you ended up becoming?
I mean, my parents have nothing to do with music. I don't really know what my dad did. He sort of was like a stock controller, or he took stock, like a white collar job. I've no idea. And my mum went back to university in her 30s and went on to become a lecturer. Uh-huh. But I think the music side from me came from my older brother, Jez, and my cousins, Mark and Loz. They just all used to collect music. And being from an Irish family, you would go over at Christmas, there was always, you'd have to sing you'd have to sing a song, whether it was like Summertime, Billie Holiday, whatever, like everyone had to do a turn. Uh-huh. So there was just, music was just very much part of the family makeup. And so I guess I can credit it really thinking about music in a sort of, I guess, critical sense, as I started to as a journalist, and collecting music. That definitely sort of originated, I'd say, from my older brother and cousins.
So the trajectory could have been that you became a musician yourself.
Oh, I did play guitar for a bit. I was terrible. So no, and I can't sing. I think it was the journalism aspect. I really liked writing. Liked writing as a kid. Liked doing lots of like imaginative writing, creative writing. So there was a bit to do with that, and it was a love of hip hop. And somewhere those worlds collided, and somehow it made sense for me to do journalism. But it was never planned. What I thought I was going to be was an actress. I wasn't very good at acting, so luckily I decided to not do that anymore. And yeah, it sort of came back quite accidentally, really.
So there was a creative thing that needed an outlet, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There was some sort of creative urge, I guess. And perhaps, there was definitely something in me. And as I couldn't sing or rap, then I thought I might as well write about it.
Okay. So how did grime happen?
Well, it kind of I think it came about from a sort of sense of rejection from the UK garage scene. A lot of new people were coming through. A lot of the young boys were kind of, in their mid to late teens, and they wanted to make music, but the UK garage scene were like, no, you guys are all this sort of very ragtag. You're wearing like trainers and tracksuits. These are kids literally from estates and quite tough areas of East London. And garage at that point was very flossy, very shiny, very Moet, very Hennessy, very Moschino, like very designer. And they just didn't want these kids. So that kind of rejection, I sort of feel like it spiraled them into another direction. And slowly over time, through various different people, although obviously Wiley is quite often rightly credited as being the godfather of grime, he's the one that kind of brought it all together. But different people started to make different sounds. They started to speed up beats, like they started to remix drum and bass and garage and jungle and all these different sounds that became known as Esky beat and Sublow and 8-bar and all these different names until it sort of coalesced and kind of officially became grime around 2003 or 4. But it was, I think that sense of rejection from the garage scene. It was also, if you look at that time, 2001, 9/11 had just happened, and lots of the kids that were making grime lived right by Canary Wharf, right in the middle of Limehouse. So they would look out onto Canary Wharf, and they would see these symbols of huge success and wealth that they were looking at every day, but no way able to touch. And 2, these were the symbols that could at any point get planes crashed into them.
Right.
And so I think there were lots of things like that. There were lots of social problems at the time in East London. Youth clubs were closing down, schools were terrible, healthcare was awful. There were lots of problems. And so they started to make music that sounded like the despair and the anger and the frustration I think that they felt at that time. Well, that's my understanding from talking to people. That's hopefully not me just making it up. And that's sort of during the course of doing the book and just having done interviews with people over the years, that's kind of what I've taken away from it, from people that very much were at the heart of the scene. That's kind of how I believe it all kind of came to be.
There's one genre of music you haven't mentioned, which is dubstep, and it shares that 140 BPM thing. And I wonder, is that coincidental? How much overlap is there between those things?
Oh, big overlap. Well, lots of people in dubstep were in grime, like people like Plastician, had his feet in both worlds. The night forward at Plastic People was like a dubstep night, but then lots of grime MCs would turn up there, like D-Double would turn up there to MC because there was nowhere else for them to play really or to spit, so they would go to places like Forward just to practice, alongside like people like Miss Dynamite. So the worlds were really overlapped, and it was the same sort of culture. It was all very much based in record shops. For dubstep it was Big Apple and Croydon. For grime it was Ribbon Division on the Roman Road. So the same sort of culture and the same sort of people and the same sort of thing. It was a bunch of mates making music, which is what grime had been, and certainly with dubstep, Scream and Benga and all those guys down in South London, like that was the same sort of thing. It was just a bunch of mates making music. And so, dubstep sort of sprang out of grime, and I guess it was a lot more instrumental led. Well, was instrumental. But the worlds were certainly very related and very close. And lots of MCs ended up kind of finding careers in that dubstep world for a long time. And then obviously like Diplo and people like that came along and ruined it and made it EDM. But what are you going to do?
Well, I was going to ask you a question about that, the sort of I guess whether you call it the maturity or the sellout or whatever it is, where something starts really, really underground and then becomes sort of hyper mainstream, and the changes and the sacrifices that are made along the way. I mean, is there still this kind of grassroots going on there, or has grime changed?
Oh, grime's changed massively. I mean, and it's changed many times as well. It's sort of first wave of success. It absolutely sort of threw everything it stood for in the bin a little bit. The BPM went, these very commercial hooks came about, the clothing changed, it all became pretty clean. And lots of people made some good money for a little while. And then I think there was a realization that actually no one actually liked the music they were making. No one was particularly happy creatively. They'd made money, but it was, not necessarily satisfying. So when Meridian Dan made German Whip, I think Skepta was like, okay, there's still something here in this grime thing. And that sort of started the wave of people returning very much to what grime had been, which was the BPMs and the tracksuits, and people like Stormzy obviously became hugely successful. But, you see the same thing again. Stormzy's album, which I love, isn't a strictly grime album. It's not Boy in the Corner that Dizzee made. There's gospel on there, there's R&B. So the same things have happened again. You're seeing, Skepta's doing a lot more kind of rap and drill now. Not really drill, but like a lot more rap than grime. So you're sort of seeing again, as the success happens, you see people then exploring other avenues. So it's interesting with grime because it does seem to sort of make the same, I don't know if it's mistakes, but it seems to repeat the same patterns that it has in the past. So yeah, there's still very much an underground scene happening, but it's much, much smaller than it was in 2003, 2004.
Right. Would you classify it as a political music?
Very political, yeah. It's completely political. And I think there's always been the idea that grime was violent and negative, but misogynist, etc., etc. But actually, there were songs that were like that. But actually, really, it was much more political than it was ever given credit for, and much more political than perhaps, say, drill is these days. Drill is a whole sort of different thing, but grime was definitely, there's so much politics in grime. Someone like Wiley is a perfect example. His lyrics are littered with, really potent, powerful messaging about racial identity and social politics. Someone like Stormzy, this is a really obvious answer, but when he used his stage at the Brits, he had one shot to perform at the Brits, and he took that opportunity to directly address Theresa May and Grenfell. So yeah, it's in its DNA. I think grime is political because it could only be political. It came from politics. It came from this Tory government that had kind of taken away and stripped everything down. The 80s, all the crap that had come in the 80s and decimated whole communities. The factories all closing down in East London and Dagenham and places like that, which happened again in the 80s and ruined whole communities, and the impact on that in places like Bow. So yeah, it came from lots of political and social issues that have kind of blighted, I suppose, the country over the last 30 years.
How uniquely British is it? And within that, how uniquely London is it?
It's hard to say because you do now find Korean grime and obviously grime MCs from Nottingham, Glasgow, which is brilliant. But I guess it's a bit like hip hop. Hip hop has huge influences from Jamaica. Hip hop kind of essentially was sort of taken from the idea of Jamaican music when Kool Herc came over to New York. And you get hip hop everywhere now, but hip hop to me is always going to be New York, and grime is always going to be not just London, but East London. These things are like a perfect storm, aren't they? I think so many different things happen to help build a musical scene, which then becomes a culture. Grime, it's kind of a culture. Well, it is a culture now. So yeah, it's uniquely the slang, the clothes, the way the clothes are worn, the sound of the beats. You definitely would never get an American making a beat like a grime beat. Absolutely no way. It could only be British. It could only be London. It could only be East London.
When it comes to growing a scene, one of the people who gets credited a lot for this is Marianne Hobbs. Mm-hmm. What was her involvement and influence?
I would say Marianne Hobbs and dubstep 100%. She was the Chantal Fiddy of dubstep, although in a different way, because obviously she was on the radio and Chantal was a journalist. But yeah, Marianne, I would say more with dubstep. She was certainly someone that championed it, nourished it. From what I understood, she was very much an advisor to lots of people. She spoke to lots of artists. She helped lots of artists in different ways, behind the scenes. A huge part of sort of disseminating and explaining this incredible music to perhaps people that were new to it.
Did grime have a champion like that?
Well, I'd say Chantal, yeah. So she was the person that played me grime festival. So Shan was a journalist. I guess Martin Clark as well. It's hard to, do you know what? It's hard to say because Marianne obviously was on the radio. There's lots of champions in terms of like DJ Target on the radio or like Rinse FM. I suppose with grime, there were so many different people. There were photographers that you could credit that really helped to sort of visualize what grime was and take that to places. So yeah, I don't know if there's any one person, but certainly Chantal was someone that, again, like Marianne Hobbs, didn't just write about grime, but was very much a part of connecting different people. So like Mike Skinner wanted a remix and she was like, oh, you should get this guy called Skepta to be on the remix, and there's a guy called Wretch 32, he's quite good, these were complete unknowns at that point,
right? So
there was a lot going on behind the scenes. I'd say Chantal unofficially was kind of like an A&R in that sense.
And pirate radio, things like Rinse FM, obviously.
Huge. Yeah. Sarah, again, this is another person that's super important. Sarah Lockhart was part of Rinse, and she was also had a publishing arm, I think is EMI. So lots of people's first publishing checks were directly created by Sarah, and lots of people, I think in the book that I wrote, I think quite a few people mentioned her, like that's the first actual serious check I got. So people like, Sarah was super influential and important as well.
What's really interesting is most of the names you've given me so far are women's names.
I know. Well, there's Rebecca as well, and I can't pronounce her last name. Rebecca Proshnik, who's a live agent. She again she took the boys on their very first trip. I think it was Target. There was 3 or 4 of them. Took them to Iron Appa. That was the first time grime had left London. Well, had certainly left England. So yeah, there are lots of really key women, and people often do say, "Oh, it's such a male genre, and why aren't there more women?" And like, there's plenty of women, and there was lots of women, female MCs as well. But women behind the scenes, I would say, have been hugely influential. Question about the internet: how much has that played a part? And what have been the sort of online scenes that have really helped grime? Well, grime was. It's interesting because initially with how it was spread was through old-fashioned tapes. So you would listen to Rinse or Deja or whatever and record it, and then you might pass that tape around your school, and someone might pass that to their cousin, and that would eventually find its way up to Manchester and Birmingham and places. That's how it originally. So very much rooted in very old-fashioned ways, but very quickly MSN Messenger came in, and that was one of the first sort of technologies that grime really took hold of. It also really was, lots of beats were made on PlayStation as well. So again, really from its very beginning, it was utilising new technologies, and it has continued to do that through MySpace. Like JME was huge on MySpace, and I think a lot of the success from 2014 to now of people like Skepta and Stormzy, who aren't signed to a major label, a lot of that is through social networks, so their own social networks and the scene around it. So if someone releases a track now, Giggs puts out an album, you're going to see 300 people posting about that as well, his peers and his friends. So grime has hugely utilised that, and was in the early days. I remember, we would get people from like Japan and New York wanting to talk to us because they had stuff sent through LimeWire. So yeah, all these things. I think grime was like, at the time that the music industry was panicking about what was going to happen, what the internet was going to do to grime. Grime was like, this isn't worrying at all. Like let's utilise it and really get behind it, because they could see how powerfully it was helping to spread their music. Right. So what's happening now that's exciting in the scene? With grime, it's tricky. It's gone into a bit of a funny place again, I think, after the huge success of Stormzy and Skepta. There are a few new artists that are coming through, but there aren't enough. What was great about Skepta's sort of resurgence was that Stormzy was right behind him, and Novelist, Bonkers. There was a whole load of new talent, and it doesn't really feel the same. What's happened now is drill, rap, Afrobeat is really dominating. I don't know, Black British music. That's the story at the moment. So grime, it's fine. It's been through its downs before. It'll come back again, but at the moment, I'd say it's a little bit dormant, and it's sort of in the shadow slightly of drill. Who's your book for? Well, my book was for the scene. It was just for those guys. I just wanted them to, like, or their mums or whatever, to go into library in 20 years' time and pick it off the shelf and be like, wow, look what my kids did, or look what my dad did, or my mum did. I just wanted to document it in some way for them, and that's why I did it as an oral history rather than me saying what I thought grime was. I just took the words from everybody and rearranged them in a nice order. Let them tell their story. Yeah, exactly. It's a really interesting thing to do, but I imagine it's something that is going to be picked up and studied. In the kind of the context where you were originally going to go and study hip-hop music, now people are going to be able to go and do a master's degree in grime, and you're going to be the core text. That's funny, isn't it? Yeah. So kind of in the way I ended up going to NYU and doing an MA in hip-hop, except now maybe, people are going to do a degree in grime. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting place to be in. Yeah, interesting. So what's next for you? I want to write a film. I've sort of started writing a film, but not about grime or anything. And I don't know, I've got 2 jobs at the moment. They both finish in the summer, so who knows what's going to happen. It's quite exciting. Quite looking forward to not knowing what's next. It's interesting because grime's starting to be portrayed in film a little bit as well. There's lots of like Target's is making a film based on his book. I think Dan Hancock's is. Wiley has a film coming. Obviously Top Boy, which isn't grime, but Top Boy's coming back, which I'm sure will touch on grime and rap and drill. So yeah, we're seeing it a lot more on screen, and we're only going to see more and more, I think. Maybe I should write a film on grime, I don't know. Can I be asked? I know what I would do if I did it, though. Yeah. I'd have a woman at the front of the story. That's what I'd do. Yeah. If you were to say there was kind of a legacy of grime, what's it given us? I think it's helped to explain the sort of the black working class experience in the noughties and onwards, over the last 20 years. I think if you want to understand what people from, and it's not just from London, but from places all over the UK that are living, below the poverty line in quite crappy circumstances with not much hope, you can listen to Wiley's Gangsters or Rico's Chosen One. There's so many songs. You'll get the breadth of experience of what was happening in those last 20 years to those people. A lot of it was really sad, or worrying, but lots of it was really funny. There's a lot of humor in grime. I mean, it's incredible. It's, there's hip hop, there's jazz, and now there's grime. It's a whole musical genre. It's a whole culture that's been created. So I think it's really great for British music as a whole, as important as trip hop or UK garage, whatever you want to, whatever, or Brit pop, whatever. Like it's leaving that legacy, as those other scenes have.
If someone was brand new to this, where would they start?
I'd just start with Dizzee Boy in the Corner, because it's still the best grime album, hands down. No one's touched that yet, and sadly it was made in 2003, so wow. Hopefully someone will better that at some point. There's been other great albums I absolutely love, Kano and Skepta and Stormzy, but it's the perfect grime album. It's pure, unadulterated grime, and I think listening to that, you'll understand a lot more about what it is.
It's kind of blue for grime.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Basically. Yeah.
Amazing. Hattie, thanks so much for being with us.
You're so welcome. Thanks,
Cheers.
Bubba.
That's Hattie Collins, author of This Is Grime, and that's the MTF Podcast. Hope you enjoyed, and if you did, remember to share, like, rate, review, and tell your friends. If you want to get involved in Music Tech Fest, go to musictechfest.net/register. And if you want to subscribe to this podcast, which is totally free and just means you'll get each episode delivered to you as soon as it's ready, you can do that in your podcast player of choice, or just go to musictechfest.net/MTF Podcast and hit the subscribe button there. Have a great week, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.